Welcome to the Airbrush Online School, everyone. My name is Marissa Oosterlee and I'm a professional teacher for more than 15 years. In this free webinar, I'd like to talk about 7 things that many airbrush artists always do wrong. The first thing I'd like to talk about is doing everything freehand. Should you do it or should you not do it? I know there's a lot of discussions going on in airbrush forums about, oh, I did everything freehand, but then you'll end up with muddy looking airbrushy portraits. Is that really what you want? If we talk about realism, and we're going to have a look at this little painting here, there are certain things that you cannot do. Let's have a look at what you should and what you should not do. You can see that this painting here is made during the Airbrush Online School studies. It's not very big. If it's not very big, it's also not very easy to do things freehand. And for that reason, we use a stencil to protect the background from the face. This also gives another advantage, that the face looks in front and the background is background. If you would do everything freehand, it becomes a bit muddy and airbrushy and you don't really know what is what. So that's one of the things, one of the reasons why you shouldn't do everything freehand, especially when you're just starting. Because another thing is that when you're starting, you don't have the control to do everything freehand because of the edges. There are 3 edges that you can use in realism, and that is the hard one, the intermediate one, and the soft one. The soft one and the intermediate one are both not really a problem to do them freehand, but the hard ones, they can be a real struggle. And for that we can use erasers or a piece of paper, simple things to make your life easier and to speed up the time of the artwork. If you do everything freehand, it needs so much training and so much time to do it perfect, and why would you do that? In the end, it's about the end result and about what the customer wants and not what you want to brag with on social media. But to close this discussion, because I also love freehanding and I use it a lot, I think you just need to take things in consideration. First of all, you need lots of time, you need lots of training, you need a super good, clean working airbrush, and also reasoning. You need good reasoning. Why do you do this? Why do you want this? For example, if I work on my own artworks in my free time, I have absolutely no problem to work a little bit longer on something that I really want to do that way. But if I have a commission and I have a deadline that is super tight, and then I'm not even going to hesitate, of course, to take a pencil or a piece of paper to do that specific thing in 2 seconds instead of 10 minutes or even 3 hours. So remember that if you're working for other people's commissions, that time is money. Let's jump to the second point, the tools of the trade. Why do so many people give so much importance to all those tools that you can get out there on the market? Well, of course, it's cool to show the newest bling bling on your airbrush, a high trigger, a low trigger, but does it really matter? No. If your airbrush feels comfortable and if you feel comfortable to work with your airbrush, then it's all fine. For example, I work with an Iwata 0.18 just because it's so responsive and I can rely on it. Also, I have small hands, so taking a bigger and longer body of an airbrush doesn't make much sense for me. It just feels uncomfortable unless I need to do a big mural, because then I have bigger distance and I don't need to hold it that tight or that close to me. So it also depends on how big you are working, what do you like to work with, what do you like to paint, realism or pop art. They are different things. So it doesn't mean that if your favorite airbrush artist is using that tool, that you also need it. Not everyone has the same budget, but it doesn't mean that you cannot become a good airbrush artist. Also, fine lines, people are a little bit obsessed with that. Of course, I can make fine lines with my 0.18, but it does not mean that I cannot do it with an Eclipse, for example, which is a 0.5. I can do the same thin lines, but it doesn't feel comfortable. So for me, it's all about comfort, reliability, responsiveness of the airbrush. That is so much more important than how it looks and how expensive it is. Another thing is the brands of paint. There are so many brands of paint out there, and it doesn't mean that only one of them is good. I'm going to show you some samples of the same color that look completely different, and then I will tell you my reason of why I have all those colors, simply because I maybe need that one. Let me grab some paper and some paint and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. We are going to sample with the burnt sienna. So this is burnt sienna by Createx. it has a little ball in the jar, so that means it's a thicker paint. It needs to be shaped very well. And if there's no ball in there, it usually means that it's a thinner paint and it needs less shaking. The best way to shake it, by the way, is to tap it on the butt, but it makes a lot of noise with the microphone, and then hold it upside down. First, I'll just put it on the canvas. Now I have a burnt sienna by Schminke. It has no ball in it, so it's a thinner paint. You can already see from there that it looks totally different. It's maybe a different property. That means it can be more opaque or more transparent. In this case, probably more transparent because it's super dark when it's not spread out. This is the Liquitex burnt sienna. It also has no ball in it, means also it's thin paint. And we can see it resembles a little bit more the first color, but it's thinner. You can also see that this one looks more opaque. And here we have the burnt sienna by Holbein. It also has a ball in it, so it's thick like the first one of Createx. That's because Holbein colors are super pure. They have the purest pigments I've ever seen. It means they need a little bit more water to dilute them to be able to spray good. But they are fantastic paints. And here you can see the true sienna because Holbein uses true pigments. And you can also see that from the way that the label indicates them. This is series A. You have A until F, and that means you're buying pure pigments. Usually in airbrush color, they all have the same price, but with Holbein you pay per series. Now let me spread them out a little bit so you can see the difference. You can already see a big difference, and they're all burnt sienna, but when I spread them out, you can see the property of the color, whether they are opaque or more transparent. And opaque means that they can cover. Let me just use a brush and spread out the paint. So this is the first Createx. You can see it's a nice, warm, orange looking sienna. And it's quite thick. I wouldn't say really opaque, but it's quite thick. It's like a semi-opaque. I clean the brush and then I go to the second one. Which is the Schminke. It's very covering. Let's spread it out a little bit more so we can see the true color of it. And it's more reddish. You can see that the burnt sienna of the Schminke is more reddish. Another way to reveal the true color is to add a drop of white. But white, of course, also makes it more opaque. Now let's clean the brush a little bit with some water to not pollute the next color too much. And here we have the Liquitex burnt sienna. Oh, it's super thin. You can see it's running, even if you drag it out, it's running down. And it spreads like water. But it looks very similar to the sienna of the Createx. It's just thinner. So when you know this, when you get to know your colors, you can also act like that. You see, you know that this is thinner. So act like it. And then we have the final one of Holbein. It's super opaque. It's maybe the most opaque of them all. It's incredibly pure and it needs a lot of spreading out to see the real color. But it resembles this one, and this one is just a lot thicker, but it's orange. It's not red. You see, it's not red like the Schminke. So you can see the differences in these siennas. They're all burnt sienna. They are different brands, but they all do something else. So you cannot just rely on one color or one brand. I think you need to figure out which one fits with you, and or like me, do like me and get 2 or 3 different burnt siennas, because they all have their own magic. Everyone can do something else. So my point is that you should not rely on your favorite airbrush artist and what they are using is good. You should rely on yourself and your needs. So do you need a more opaque paint, or do you need a very transparent paint because you want to do a lot of freehanding, or do you need something in between, like this or this? Also, every good brand has an indicator on the bottle that tells you if it's more opaque or more transparent, or somewhere in the middle. For example, here the Holbein has an indicator on the side. We can see that this one is really opaque, so this is transparent. then you have something in the middle, closer to opaque, and this is fully opaque. So we know that this one is really opaque. You can also see it. That does not mean that white, for example, has the same opacity as this one, but at least we know that they are opaque. And that does not mean that this brand, Schminke over here, is also opaque, because he has his own making. And we can see here on the label that is lasierend or transparent. That means it's not opaque, it's the opposite. You can also see that it's quite transparent. I can see everything underneath still. It's a little thicker than Liquitex, but it's still transparent. It doesn't cover like that one. But you can see there's an indication, maybe not with the same 4 indicators as Holbein, but it says what it does, lasierend or is transparent. Then we have the Liquitex, has another indication on the label, and that is a square. An open square with the same color as the label, that means it's transparent. You can see through. If this block would be black or white, it would be a different color than the label, and that would mean that the color is opaque. You can also see a little line through the square, that means it's semi-opaque or semi-transparent. Semi-opaque would be one side is filled with a color and the other side is open, and semi-transparent is just a line. And then the final bottle, Createx, it does not have an indication. It's really just an illustration of more commercial, purely airbrush color. This brand doesn't make any other colors than airbrush colors, and the other 3 brands, they also make acrylic paints or oil paints, etc., and they really use those indicators. So this one, you just have to test it for yourself. How can you test it? The best way is to have a black piece of paper and then see if the color lightens up and covers or not. If it lightens up and it covers, you know that it's a covering pigment. The important thing is that you know your materials and you need to know why you're using it and how to use it. If you don't know how to use it, simply ask your supplier. They should know it because they're selling it, or read the labels and instructions that you can find on the products. Don't just go with the hypes because he or she is using that and that is the most promoted item at the moment. Just don't fall for that too much. Find it out by yourself and see what works for you. It does not mean that with a cheap airbrush you cannot make fantastic artworks. I can grab any airbrush and do the same with it. It's for me just about comfort and reliable and being in control of my tool because I feel comfortable with it. And another thing that I would like to point out is that not all the brands have, for example with paint, have the same mediums to thin them or to slow down the drying time. For example, Createx works very well with their specific reducer. It contains a little bit of solvent in it to make the paint flow better and not have so much tip dry. But if you just add water, because it says water-based paint, it does not mean that it responds the same as if I add water to Liquitex, which is a completely different paint, and it works very well with water. So also this, for example, the transparent base or the retarder, they are different things. They give different properties to the paint, and it does not mean that when you add this to the Createx, it will do the same as when you add it to the Liquitex. Also here you need to experiment. Of course it does what it says on the label, but it does not mean that they behave the same with each brand. Last but not least, I would love to tell something about the mistake of choosing only one surface, because there are so many surfaces and each of them, they do something else. So for example, here we had some canvas. I can show you some samples that I've made in the online school. This one is on canvas, it's the old lady. On canvas you can scratch, but you will see a little bit of texture. If you do, you can erase, but it has its limits because you push some of the paint into the texture of the canvas. And of course, the smoother it is, the smoother will your textures be. Also, it absorbs very well, so it's great for beginners to start working on canvas because you have less spiders and you can work also big because canvas almost has no limit in size. You can order 3 meters of canvas if you want, and it's relatively cheap compared to airbrush paper or boards. So canvas is a great service. Just for airbrushing, I think the most suitable canvas is a smooth one. In case you need to bring back some lights, you can still erase and you see less of the thin paint because we work with thin layers going in and out of the surface of the canvas. So this is canvas. And then we have some Schülerhammer. It's another sample from the online school. This is the Schülerhammer 4G. It's an illustration board. It's pressed paper. And the very big advantage of this is that you can softly erase, gently erase your lights. You can clean your lights. You cannot scratch on it because you damage the surface unless you prepare the surface with some kind of an acrylic. But I'm honestly too lazy for that, so I never do it because I don't really scratch a lot. But if you have to scratch a lot, then you can use, for example, some synthetic paper. This is a tiny study, a little sample of a quick live show, which is super easy to scratch. You can even do it just, you know, with your nails. You see how easy this scratches. It's synthetic paper. It's like plastic, so the paint has less grip to it. That means that if you erase, it goes quite abrupt. You need to be careful with that. And it's super shiny, so sometimes you don't want that. Also, that's something to take into account. And another great surface to scratch on is, for example, clayboard. It also allows you to scratch with knives, with glass fiber pencils, with anything that can scratch, not with the nails. For that, it's too strong. So you see it's less shiny and less smooth than the synthetic paper, but it's smooth enough to scratch. And you can also erase really nice on it. It's very stable, it's matte. So you see that some of the surfaces have equal properties, but they all have their own specialties. And of course, we also have normal paper or handmade paper, which is super ultra absorbing, impossible to erase. It's also that you need to take into account when you use it for the airbrush. There is also airbrush paper. It's like a thinner version of the board that I showed you earlier, the Schülerhammer board. There's Hanemühle airbrush paper and Schülerhammer airbrush paper. They are the most known. You can erase on it and you can airbrush on it without spiders, but you cannot scratch it. So one more thing that I'd like to show you is another small demo that I made in a live show. This is the debond panel. It's black and it needs a clear coat to make it nice and shiny, like a car, but it behaves a little bit like clayboard. It's a little smoother also, so erasing doesn't behave super nice like clayboard, but it can be done. And it's just another feeling. It spiders a little bit more because it's smoother. You can scratch it, just be careful. And it's great if you want to practice, for example, automotive art, such as cars and helmets. So it's great preparation for the custom automotive scene. So my advice is to not just stick with one material, but to experiment and see what fits best for you. Also, if you have an eye on going to galleries and do something professional with it, paper is not the best choice because the boards, the debond or the panels, the clay boards, the Schülerhammer boards, they have more value, they are more solid, and they will just look better in a gallery. Also, shiny surfaces are a little harder to hang in the spotlights in a gallery, so I would always choose for a matte surface unless it's a glossy varnish or a resin varnish to give a finish to the painting. But that's another thing than a shiny reflecting surface, because they can be super annoying when you have some spotlights on it or glass in front of it. As you can see, it's a whole world of surfaces, and my best advice is to experiment. Even the walls, a leather bag, t-shirts, your shoes, you can paint on anything with the airbrush. That's the cool part about it. But you have to experiment and you have to find out what it is that you love about the surface. The third thing that I'd like to talk about is, why do we always go so dark? Well, this is simply because we don't know enough about values. What are values? Value is the lightness or darkness of a color. There's even a color card or a grayscale card that can help you to depict those values, and I will show you what it looks like. It's called the Grayscale and Value Finder. You can see black and white, the dark midtones and the light midtones. A midtone is something between dark and light, and this is often what we miss in airbrush paintings or in art in general. People see the darks and people see the lights, but they don't really observe what is in the middle. And observing is another super important part and reason why we often go to dark. We don't observe. We just keep painting and painting and painting, and before you know it, it's super dark and you can't really go back because you don't know what to do and how to repair things as soon as you go in with white. White is another horrible thing to make things look dirty or flat or, you know, just as wrong as is possible. But that's another story that I will point out later. It also has to do with values, because when do you use white? When things go too dark. So also to prevent this horrible blue shift, stay light and work slowly. Observe more, take your time and build up in thin layers. Thick paint can also be a reason why you go too dark, because thick paint is simply much stronger than a thinner paint. So maybe you can add some more water or a transparent medium to make it a little bit less aggressive. These things can really help you to stay a little lighter and be in control of your lights and your darks. Point number 4 is observation skills. I think that most of my students are, well, not trained in observing enough, and you can see that because they're spraying for a long time without even watching reference. I've even seen occasions where they were not watching at all because there was simply no reference next to the painting, and this is of course a big error when you want to make realism. You should also not think that great masters such as Rembrandt or Rubens, they did everything by imagination, because they had their studies for many years, and of course they've also used models, live models by then, and now we are using photos or also live models. But you're not paying a live model to just sit there, you're paying her to see her, to observe her, and the same things for a photo. Why would you print a photo if you're not even looking at it? So I think that observation is something that we all can improve until we, you know, are not there anymore. You should always be aware that observation is one of the biggest skills that you can possess when you're painting. It's always about watching and watching and watching what's going on there. What about that curve? What about that transition? And I have a sample here of 2 paintings that I made. Well, one is mine, one is my dog's. And let's have a look what's wrong there with the observation skills of my dog. Well, this here is, let's say, Mickey's, my dog, and this one is mine. And you can see that there are some differences. We can see that the observation of the tones, the values are not as it should be because they are too dark. So that means he went on too long without even observing the reference and just stopped whenever he wanted or decided that it was enough. It can also be that the paint was too thick, like I spoke before of thick paint. Maybe the paint is too thick and then you have no stop. It just goes there and, you know, before you know it, it's too late. We can also see that there is a completely different shape of the lip than there is of this good painting. The lips are a bit you know, wrinkly, and there's a too small upper lip and a way too big and a weird curvy bottom lip. I can see heavy outlines, and if you look at realism, there are no outlines. It's another super big mistake that we see in airbrushing, but also in general in art. When you do realism, don't make outlines. Don't make lines at all. There are no lines. And we can also see another weird thing, the teeth. I see some teeth, but they are barely visible. They are so dark, but they are not white. Just because we want them white, it doesn't mean that they truly are white. The same thing counts for eye white, by the way. They're always left out white. But they are not really white. They are gray, and then they reflect whatever color is surrendering the eyeball. And here we can see that the teeth are way too white, and I also see there's 4 teeth, just because we think there are 4 teeth supposed to be visible. But here I can actually only see 2. The mouth that we are looking at, by the way, is a little baby mouth. So you can see that everything is soft. There are no hard edges. And here we have super hard edges. We can see that there is a lot of moist, because it's all more moisty, more flexible than when we get a little bit older. We just dry out, let's say it like that. But we can see that the highlights are totally different. These are more like someone with lots of lipstick and more like a Jessica Rabbit kind of mouth with super hard and dirty highlights. We can also see that the lines are just invented because we think there are lines in the lip, so we just keep on painting lines. And the same thing we do with eyelashes. Why do we always paint eyelashes that simply look like that? If you observe eyelashes, they will never look like washed out spaghetti. Eyelashes are simply little hairs that are planted into our eyelids, and they are sometimes grouped together, so you usually see groups of hairs, and then only the points, they stick at the ends, they will stick out like little individual hairs here and there, but never like that. The same thing with these lines in the lip, bit the same story. Don't just put them there, and make sure that if you put the cracks of the lips, that they follow the curve of the lip. If we have a look at the right painting, you can see that the curves are the same as the shape of the line. You can see that the line is following the roundness of the lip, and they don't just stick there because for the sake of it. We can also see that the highlights are tiny, soft, yet defined, and here they are gruesome. I wouldn't even consider that to be a highlight, just a dirty line in the lip. And what else do we see? That there is absolutely no outline. There is no lip liner or whatsoever. And here we see a way too heavy outline because he wanted to do everything freehand and he needed something for the paint to stay within those lines. Another thing, except for the values not being right, is that there is so much texture that is not supposed to be there. It's a big mistake to over texturize your painting just because you think there should be skin texture. If you don't really see it like that, why would you make holes in your painting? Maybe it was looking great before, but then all of a sudden you started to dig holes into your painting. Be subtle, just observe, you know, be subtle and look at what you need, and don't just put it there because you think it should be there. And another thing is that the white here, you can see that the white, I had to put it, you know, on top because it was missing. So you're like, okay, let's grab a bottle of white and just place some white there. What happens with the white when you place it on something dark? It gets bluish. So you should actually treat white as blue. White, gray and black, they are cool. They are used in the very ancient times, like the old masters, when they were lacking blue on their palette because it was super expensive. They actually just used whites, grays and blacks for their cooler tones. And you see that that is what happens when you place white on top of dark. It optically mixes like a gray blue, and that's the dirty highlights that we see. Another huge mistake that we can find with airbrushes is the use of white. I use a lot of white. I actually make so many details and softness and volume with my white, but I know how to use it. If you don't know how to use white, be very careful with it. Don't just place a highlight on top of a darker tone underneath because it's gonna come out dirty and unnatural looking. The best thing that you can do is to preserve your lights, so just clean it up with an eraser in between, or get to know your colors and know how to color correct this white. The opposite color of blue would be a warmer color such as orange. The orange can be more yellow or more red, and that will counteract the blue shift that we see here. So what you can do is mist over a tiny bit of that warmer color or add it into your white preventively to cause a more neutral highlight. Now, we can also see that the teeth, they are way too many and way too light. This can be prevented by using your value checker that we spoke of before, and simply match the value and then check if your values are the same. Now I can show you with an isolation fencer how dark the skin or the lips really are. Let's just say that here and here you can see a huge difference in darkness or in lightness. We can see that this one is super light and this one is super dark compared to that corner. So I know I overshot my value. So there are truly things that can help you to measure and to see the things or the mistakes that you're making better, or you can prevent them. Another thing that you see often is that it's flat. You can see that these lips are totally flat and these, they are round and plumpy, just like, you know, healthy looking lips, and this looks a bit more like a cartoon or a sticker. Now, what is causing that effect? That is a lack of contrast. Also observation, of course, because you didn't see the values that you had or were supposed to paint. But it means that there is no difference in light or dark. The only dark that I see is here in the corner and the super heavy shading in the separation of the lips, the corners of the lips. And the rest of the lips is an equal darkness or lightness of that same red color. That can be because I've used a super, or Mickey's used a super opaque red. For example, a red in a bottle. Let's see. This red over here is called Total Cover. It's from Schminke, and it will give you just that color, but it also causes a super flat look. You know, everything is this red. That's what Total Cover colors do, a really opaque color. Now, how can you prevent that? By or using an underpainting, so you put your values underneath, or mix multiple colors that match that particular area of the lip, and then you're working with an opaque color palette. For an opaque color palette, you need to know your colors, you need to know how you mix, and when you work with an underpainting, you can add colors in slow steps and you have much more control over the values and then later over the colors. It's a pleasant way of working, in my opinion, but you need to know them both. So this totally flat result is just a cause of no observation, a lack of color skills, and totally lack of contrast. Contrast is the difference between light and dark, and if you have everything the same darkness or lightness, it looks super flat. Like if you have a circle and everything is white, it just looks like a circle. Once you start shading the ball, for example, or the circle with a darker bottom and a slightly lighter inside and then a lighter top, then you create a transition for going from light to mid-tone to dark, and you have an optically round ball instead of just a circle. Now, this is super important when you paint realistic, because with the lack of values, contrast, we simply cannot create this 3D illusion. Point 5. Don't throw it in the bin, just make sure that you know how to make corrections in your paintings. So you can see that I've just done a super speedy version of a correction on this lip here. The only thing I couldn't correct is the damage on the paper, because Mickey has been scratching and scrubbing it real good, and this is impossible for me to correct. But you can also see it's genuine. I've really painted over the ugly painting and I've improved it. That means that you don't need to throw things in the bin if they don't go well from the start, and it also should help you to build up more confidence once you have knowledge about how to correct mistakes. And in my workshops and also in my online courses, I show a lot of extra sessions on how to correct, because this is so important. It really builds up that confidence, and this way you will also not leave your painting too light because you are simply so afraid that you don't dare to go on anymore, and you'll just leave your painting in an unfinished stage. So I think that this is one of my most important lessons during all of my workshops, is that how do you fix things that were looking off or horrible, or how do you remove paint because maybe someone splattered on it, or you were shaking a bottle when the lid was open. This happens a lot too. I've seen that in my classes, including on one of my originals, by the way, that I could, thank God, fix. But it's always, you know, a heart attack when you don't know how to fix that. So learn how to correct your mistakes, and it's going to make you a much better and more freer artist. And it's so much more pleasant to work when you don't have to be afraid all the time, because fear is something that paralyzes us and it's certainly not going to help us. So corrections is a very big part of my lessons. And okay, it's not perfect, but I've just demonstrated in 15 minutes, and you'll see a speed up version, that it's all possible. You can overpaint everything. You just need to know how color works and how correcting works. Point number 6 is the dilution and the pressure that often goes wrong. I see that people, when they take paint, they simply throw and throw and throw until their cup is full, but then there's no space to add water or medium to do something with the paint to make your life easier. So my first tip in this chapter is that you don't overshoot the paint. So don't just use it as a pipe hole and keep throwing paint in there. First of all, it's a waste of paint. You're going to end up throwing a lot of paint away, and it's expensive. It's not for free, remember that. And the second thing is there is no space for water or medium or whatsoever. So don't overshoot the paint in the cup, okay? Then the other thing is, if you're working with a pure paint because you had no space for water anymore, then you have to increase the pressure. So if you use a pure paint that I have right now in my cup, I have a pure burnt umber in the cup, and I'm going to reduce my pressure. You can hear that I have this little mag valve to make it higher or lower the sound. You can hear the air. You hear that? I'll just do it up and down so you can hear it. You can also hear my compressor is working harder to keep up with me. So I'm gonna put it really low, because some people say, how high is your pressure? And if I would say 1, everyone would be putting it on 1 bar. Well, watch what's happening if I put this on 1 bar, which is about, not even this, it's very low, 1 bar, which is like 10 psi or something, maybe even less. So this is about 1 bar, and let's see what happens with a pure paint without any water, because I had no more space in my cup. It's not even coming out, and I have to pull so hard in my trigger that it's just splattering all at once, and you're like, oh yay, something's coming out, and then you want to paint with it, and like, oh my god, that looks horrible. You see, I have absolutely no control, and everything I do is dark and dirty and splattery. Now let's see what happens if I increase the pressure. You can hear more sound now coming out. There it is. You can see that the paint behaves much friendlier, and even with a pure dark paint, I am now more in control of what I'm doing. I can build up in layers, and I have much less splatters, and it's also reacting faster, so the response is much better, and that helps a lot. Now let's see the other thing when the paint is super thin. So when the paint is super thin, you can certainly not use a high pressure that I'm having right now. You see that the grain is disappearing when I have a high pressure with thick paint, and the grain is appearing when I have a low pressure with thick paint. But now I'm going to make it really thin with water, dilute it, and leave the same pressure, which is high, and you'll see what happens. I have a lot of space in the cup again, so there is space for me to add water. Now let's just overshoot it with water as much as I can. Then we backflush it. This is for mixing the water with the paint. And you always want to do a little test, because there's always some old paint in that reservoir of your airbrush. Like this part, there's some old paint left in there. So I just do this, and then you know that you have your thin paint. Now let's keep the pressure high, or even make it higher, and then see what happens if I just shoot a little dot or a line. Ooh, you see that? There's so much pressure that the air is going too fast for the paint. And it's just like, phew, it's scattering everywhere. We call this a spider. So spiders are a cause of high pressure and thin paint. Now let's keep the same paint and lower that pressure. And this simple trick can really improve your life. Just knowing this, I mean, look at the improvement. Now we can do the same thing for this thin paint. We just need to lower the pressure, okay? Let's do the same thing. You see, I was making the same line over there, but this time with so much more control. And now I'm happy. I can do anything now. You see, super thin, sharp lines. There's no grain. I can make little lines and circles, and they're perfect. So a thick paint is a high pressure, and a thin paint is a lower pressure. And last but not least, tip number 7 is don't rush. Rushing is never a good thing, especially in painting, because it's harder to correct than to just take your time and do it right. I always say, think 3 times and then paint 2 times, or even 1 time if you can do that. So it's observing and then painting. And what I also see when you rush is that you tend to put way too much focus in details such as eyelashes or skin, pores and textures, or over scratched and sharp hairs, or way too many hairs, things that go too much in a row instead of a bit more organic. These are all things because we are rushing and we're not really observing our reference. And it's also super important that if you work for a customer, that you capture the soul of a portrait, and not how many textures or how many wrinkles you've put in that portrait. That's not really flattering, is it? Now, if I would like to commission someone to paint me, I expect that this painting is looking more pretty than I really am, because else I would hang a photo on the wall. Now, I think that it's just very important that you know how to build up a painting, and that is with the foundation first. So first you make sure that you have your shadows, your midtones and your lights. Your proportions needs to be in order. And then you can render some kind of a texture just to imply that this is hair and this is skin instead of wood. And then when everything is solid together and it looks like a good face, then you can start thinking about refining some nuances such as eyelashes or mini hairs in the eyebrow, or maybe a little fluffy hair there and an extra pore over there. Now, this is the end of my tips. I hope this works out fine for you, whether you're airbrushing or painting. I think you can use it all.